Hello guys, welcome to another video. Now in this one I'm going to be discussing my build that I'm playing right now for the Legacy of Phrecia, my starter build, and that is an Ancestral Commander, and it's a Totem build. It's actually Flamewood Totem. Now I didn't actually plan any build before the event started. It was literally the day of the event start and I finally decided that I wanted to play a Totem build. And initially my plan was to play Holy Flame Totem because I really like the transfigured version of that skill. But I realised that this probably wasn't going to work on the Ancestral Commander because Holy Flame Totem, even on a Hierophant in the base game, isn't very strong with all of that extra damage factored in. And you need some really good gear to actually get the skill to deal a lot of damage. So I kind of took the best of both worlds there and I leveled with Holy Flame Totem and then I swapped over to Flamewood a little bit further into mapping. And I thought I'd just go through my leveling here for that build, because I think some people may be interested in exactly how I leveled it, and it's pretty similar to Pox's RF leveling setup for Marauder, which is kind of a caster setup. He really goes deep into the whole muling of skills. I think he actually levels a Witch to level 4. I don't bother with any of that. I just muled a Templar to be able to get Rolling Magma and Elemental Proliferation, and then you just grab Holy Flame Totem as soon as you can and get added fire damage as well. And you basically just path through Born to Fight here, and then you grab Magmatic Strikes and take the Mastery for 100% increased damage against ignited enemies. And you can also grab Arsonist as well for a little bit more ignite damage. But mostly you're just going to be leveling with Holy Flame Totem and Rolling Magma, and obviously grab Frostblink when you can there for your movement. Then you just path up here, grab more damage. You can also grab the life here and take Holy Dominion, which is some nice resistances and damage there. And essentially, what you're planning to do here is, as soon as you get to Act 3 and you're actually ready to ascend, you're going to be right here ready to take Ancestral Bond. And then when you actually do ascend, you're going to take Forest of Ancestors as your first notable in the first lab, which will bring your maximum number of totems up to 2. And then you're actually going to spec into Ancestral Bond immediately after taking that, and you're going to drop Rolling Magma from that point onwards. So you go from having 1 Holy Flame Totem to 3, and it just becomes this very kind of easy and straightforward leveling through the campaign, which is just having 3 maximum totems, and all you do is just run along plopping down your totems and they just do everything for you. And honestly, 3 Holy Flame Totems through the campaign is perfectly fine. They actually feel very, very powerful, especially when you go over here and you grab Elemental Overload, because this is going to be up all the time. They have very high cast speed. And you can also come over here and grab Heart of Flame, and you can just basically fill out the damage nodes, come back for this penetration here and extra damage. And then, you know, as you're leveling up, you can actually decide to start speccing into some endurance charges, because that will be your second lab, actually grabbing the maximum endurance charges. And, you know, you can fill out all of this. And eventually you want to come down here and actually grab the minimum endurance charge node and the mastery for 100% increased charge duration. So one of the things about the Ancestral Commander is that even though it has +3 to maximum endurance charges, it doesn't have a way to generate the charges. So one thing that I can recommend, no matter what build you play on the Ancestral Commander, is a way to actually generate charges in your build. And some people are just going to be using Enduring Cry as, you know, as just a standalone war cry that they cast when they're fighting, which is fine. And as long as you actually have that charge mastery, that will be fine for charge generation, especially for melee builds. But for other builds that kind of don't really have that option, I mean, on this build, I'm playing Totems, so I don't really have too many options in terms of gaining endurance charges on kill. For example, this here grants you 8% chance to gain an endurance charge on kill, but the only way you gain that from your Totem kills is if your Totem kills something with damage over time. Ignite is very rarely killing any monsters, which means that endurance charge on kill mechanics are not really working very well for that build. And so I can recommend a way to actually gain endurance charges. One of those things is Enduring Composure, which is really nice. Every time you actually get hit, you gain an endurance charge every second for 4 seconds, which is going to be really good for your endurance charge generation. And as I said, Enduring Cry is an option there. Remember that you need to actually self-cast Enduring Cry. You can't put it onto Auto Exertion because it doesn't grant charges. Now, once you've actually leveled with a Holy Flame Totem setup and you want to switch over to Flamewood, my advice would be to either get March of the Legion or Black Zenith. Now, early on in the league, March of the Legion is going to be the more accessible item, because Black Zenith only comes from the Poop boss, and it's a 5% drop rate, I believe, so it's not very accessible early on in the league, but it does become more and more accessible as the league goes on, and the invites to that boss also become more and more accessible, so if you actually want to farm out yourself, you can do that. But March of the Legion is a more accessible item because it's a global unique drop, and with +5 to the level of socketed aura gems, you're basically going to be using Rejuvenation Totem, which has an aura tag, and levels for this totem scale the life dramatically. So the plan there is that you place Rejuvenation Totem into March of the Legion. This is actually how I leveled through early maps into kind of early red maps, is with March of the Legion, and that actually scales the life of Rejuvenation Totem, which then means that Flamewood deals more damage, because Flamewood is scaling its damage directly based on totem life. You can see here that it deals 137% of the totem's maximum life when it actually hits with one of those projectiles. If you do actually choose to level with March of the Legion there on a Flamewood setup, I could actually recommend to you that you play Ignite instead of Hit. And the reason for that is that on this side of the tree here, you don't have very good dexterity scaling, and one of the things to actually make Hit work on Flamewood is multiple projectiles. You need greater multiple projectiles to actually make that skill feel really good and deal a lot of damage. But the difference between March of the Legion and Black Zenith is that the damage scaling between the two items is completely different. As I mentioned, March of the Legion scales the gem levels of the totem, which then scales the totem life. So the actual hit that comes out from that totem projectile is going to deal more damage, which means that it's actually able to scale Ignite. And using Ignite as March of the Legion is a good idea. You can use Ignite Prolif, and it's much more comfortable for mapping. Whereas when you actually go for Black Zenith, it is a purely hit-based setup. You can see it deals 150% more damage with hits, and it has a modifier there for fire 4 additional projectiles, so this is purely hit-based. Alright, so moving on, this is the build that I'm playing right now. I'm currently level 91, and I have pretty mediocre gear. I'll actually go over the gear in just a second to show you guys what's going on. So this is currently the tree that I have right now. And let's actually discuss exactly what's going on with this build. So first of all, you can notice that I'm actually pretty tanky with this build. That is with 9 endurance charges up. That's 3 from the tree and 3 from the Ascendancy. And I also have that mini Defiance of Destiny there. So this is a very, very tanky build, even with really garbage gear. And this is without the guard skill on, with Molten Shell on. You can see my max hits there go up quite a bit. So this is pretty nice build for the stage that it's at right now. It's very, very tanky. And what I'm doing in this build is I'm using 2 methods for endurance charge generation. First of all, I'm using Enduring Composure on a cluster there. As I mentioned, I really do recommend this for a way to actually generate endurance charges outside of using Enduring Cry. I am still using Enduring Cry in the build because it's really nice to be able to actually gain endurance charges in a bossing setup without the need to actually get hit. But one of the other things that I'm using is Doedre's Elixir there, which is a mana flask which actually deals a hit of damage to you. So you take 50% of your maximum life as chaos damage on use. Right now I have capped chaos resistance, so this barely does anything to me. And then you gain 3 endurance charges, 3 frenzies, and 2 power charges on use. That can roll up to 3 of each. And obviously this is a hit, so as soon as I use this flask, I'm actually going to gain 3 endurance charges, and then I'm going to gain 4 extra endurance charges, 1 per second, because of Enduring Composure. So as soon as I actually zone into a map, the first thing I do is hit Doedre's Elixir, and that's going to immediately make sure that I have my endurance charges ready to go, because without endurance charges you can see just how weak this build becomes. Turn off the endurance charges and you can see that I lose around half of my max hit there, maybe 40% of my max hit. So this is a huge amount of the defensive layers of the build, is actually just having those endurance charges up. And for that reason, one of the modifiers that I do not run on maps is the one that makes monsters steal charges from you. That is a really bad modifier, and I don't ever run that. I'm actually playing this build in hardcore trade, so if you're playing in softcore, you could probably get away with it. Especially because whenever we actually drop our totems down, they are actually taunting the monsters. So whenever you drop a totem, it actually taunts monsters for 1 second. So you don't take too much aggro while you're mapping, but obviously you are going to get hit, especially by very fast monsters, and having monsters immediately strip your charges off you, not a good idea in a build that's relying on endurance charges. So in terms of how exactly this build plays, as I mentioned, when you actually drop down a totem, it taunts monsters and then they attack that totem. Now when those monsters actually hit that totem, it will then proc Flamewood. So Flamewood support is a triggered skill, it's triggered from the totem, and it is based on a totem's maximum life. So it will deal 134% of totem's maximum life as a hit of fire damage. And you can actually see there, if we go into the calcs, we can see that currently our totem has 5,570 life, which means that our Flamewood projectiles are hitting for a base fire damage hit of 7,464 damage. But Flamewood gets really crazy when you include Black Zenith. Now these gloves, as I said, they're an exclusive drop from the Poop boss. Nobody wants to farm that guy. It's just the worst boss in the game by far, and it's a 5% drop. So you have to run an average of 20 of those bosses to get these gloves. Not something that you want to do. And the way these gloves work is they kind of provide a bunch of buffs for projectile spells. So projectile spells deal 150% more damage with hits, and they have plus 4 seconds to cooldown and fire 4 additional projectiles. There's also projectiles fired in a circle there and 80% less skill effect duration. Those last 2 modifiers do not apply to Flamewood, so we can ignore those. Now the first 3 all apply to Flamewood. So the way how Flamewood works is whenever a totem actually gets hit, it fires a projectile and it lands at the target that actually hit that totem. By default, Flamewood has a 1 second cooldown, and when you actually add this to it, it has a 4 second cooldown added on top of that, so a 5 second cooldown. But the thing is, this cooldown is only added to projectile spells, and because Rejuvenation Totem is not a projectile spell, it doesn't have a projectile tag, that means that Rejuvenation Totem doesn't inherit the cooldown, which means that you can spam Rejuvenation Totem to continuously summon your totems. Even though that cooldown happens for Flamewood, it's only tied to the specific totem that actually fired the projectile, which means that you can continuously resummon your totems so that they continuously get hit by monsters to continuously trigger this Flamewood proc, which then keeps firing projectiles and keeps dealing damage to monsters. If you've ever seen a Flamewood build in action, it's usually the case that you need to kind of be standing on top of your totems, especially in a bossing environment when you can't rely on taunt. You often need to actually stand on top of your totems to get the boss to actually hit you and the totems at the same time, to then proc all of those hits on top of the boss. Now that's the cooldown mod, but there's also the fires 4 additional projectiles there, which is ridiculous for Flamewood Totem. The way our extra projectiles work with Flamewood is that they just simply add on and all of them overlap. They are fired one after the other from the totem, they're not fired all at the same time, they kind of come sequentially out of the totem. And they literally fully overlap for full damage, which means that 4 additional projectiles is quite literally 400% more damage for this spell. And that is on top of the 150% more damage with hits. So these gloves are completely ridiculous for Flamewood Totem. It is easily the strongest item in the game for that skill. And for the most part, I would say that Flamewood Totem is pretty much unplayable without these unique gloves in the endgame. So in terms of the rest of the gear, as I said, I have really garbage gear right now. It is literally just life and resistances. You can see this scepter here, it's literally 1 mod. Like, this is just spell damage and non-chaos damage is extra chaos damage with some resistance. Literally a 1 mod item. I've got life and resistances here on my shield, more life and resistances on my body armor. Same thing on my boots, that's actually a lot of resistance there, but again, life and resistance, life and stats on my amulet, and, you know, more life and resistance on the rings there. And the plan really was to just get a lot of life and resistance to become very tanky and just be very strong in maps. And that's basically what we've done. So right now you can see that the Avenging Flame projectile is dealing 250 fire damage per hit. And that is when the monster is actually burning. So we actually have combustion on there, which means that, you know, they're getting minus 10 fire reds from that. I've also got flammability here, and I've got Wave of Conviction in a charged trap link. You have to do this if you're playing with Ancestral Bond, because obviously you can't actually deal that damage, which means you wouldn't be able to apply the exposure, so you use traps to actually be able to proc Wave of Conviction, and we can actually put our power charges and frenzies on them because we have charged traps up, which means, yeah, 280,000 damage per hit of Flamewood, and that is per projectile. So that means that every time a Flamewood actually procs and all of the projectiles hit a target, it's dealing about 1.4 million damage. Now, on average, I would say that this build is probably dealing somewhere between 2 and 3, maybe even 4 million damage. It really depends on actually how the monster interacts with the totems. Some monsters hit very quickly and they're able to proc the totems constantly and obviously deal a lot of damage back to themselves. And other monsters are really awkward. If you've ever seen someone playing Flamewood, or if you've ever played Flamewood yourself, you would know that it is actually extremely awkward of a build. And there are some things that are just really annoying. For example, the fortification in Betrayal, when the doors are just, you can't even get past them, right? Because nothing's attacking the totem, which means nothing's spawning. And you occasionally get that with some monsters. It's very rare that you actually get that kind of interaction where you actually can't progress. But sometimes it is a thing, and that is one clunky thing to do with Flamewood, which is really annoying. But I've played Flamewood enough at this point that I kind of know, what to do and what not to do. And overall, I find the build quite fun, but it definitely has its advantages and its disadvantages. One of the big advantages of this build is just how tanky it can be on very minimal gear. As I said, this Ascendancy kind of screamed Flamewood to me there in the end because, you get +1 max totems, which is really nice. You also get the 20% of damage from hits taken from your nearest totem's life before you. And that is actually a big part of our tankiness here. For example, if we actually turn off, so we've got our totem life here, that is 5 totems summoned. It's actually a little bit more than this, but 25,000 life approximately for 5 totems. If we actually remove that, you can see that our effective hit pool there drops and our max hits all drop at the same time, because this is our totems actually taking 25% of hit damage before we do. And that is happening all the time because we have 20% coming there from Forest of Ancestors and another 5% from the Totem Mastery. Now, for the 4th lab, I actually took Toughened Skin, and this is just a really nice quality of life node. It means that you don't get your action speed slowed below base value, same with movement speed, and then you get doubled armor. I'm not actually sure if this is going to be the end game setup that I'm going to be using, because I may actually go for Born Under Fire instead, which is like converting nearby monsters' physical damage into fire, which might be an idea if I decide not to go for something like Lightning Coil or Cloak of Flame. I'm using Blood Magic on this build, that is to solve mana cost. That will probably be changed in the endgame, but once again, this is actually a really nice, comfortable thing to do early on in this type of build, because you get to solve your mana cost by just spending life. I obviously have a huge amount of life regen here, which is coming in from modifiers on the tree here, and also from Rejuvenation Totem, which is up all the time. And this also provides 10% more life, which is not insignificant in this build, because having a bunch more life is really nice, obviously with all those defensive modifiers that I have. But anytime you're able to get a lot of life on the Ancestral Commander, it's extremely beneficial for that mini Ancestral Defiance node there, for the Defiance of Destiny node, because basically the more life that you have, the more effective this modifier becomes. And that's pretty much it. I just wanted to make a video kind of discussing what I'm playing in the Legacy of Phrecia event, discussing how I'm progressing on the build. I actually do have an idea for a different build that I've thought of now that I kind of like to run, because it's more of a map blaster, whereas if you've probably noticed in the footage, even though this build does a lot of damage, it's not very nice for mapping. It's not a particularly good mapping build. So I'd really like to make a map blaster, and I've had an idea for that. So it might be a reroll angle for me, and I keep this build for bossing and things like that, because that's kind of what it's made for. Flamewood is very, very good for bossing. But I actually think in an endgame setup, I'd be able to get this into a state where it's extremely powerful for bossing. It can be so much tankier than what it is right now. I'm interested in continuing progression for that, but I may reroll into a different build temporarily to do a bit of farming. But that's pretty much it, guys. How are you getting on with the Legacy of Phrecia event? Let me know by commenting below. Let me know what build you're playing. And thanks for watching this video. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.